بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. تحفة الأطفال. نحن سنقرأ أو في قراءة تحفة الأطفال. In English, we're going to read it in English. So before you get to the level of tuhfa in Arabic, you're going to read it in English. And as people that want to learn, we have to always remember that we're learning for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we want to do it to better ourselves. So it's not just learning for the purpose of theory, we just know something and that's it, but rather we're learning for the purpose of acting upon the knowledge that we learn. So it's important to always keep that in our mind, i.e. that we need to have a pure intention that is for the sake of Allah, and part of that is also that we act upon it. So we learn to remove ignorance from ourselves. We learn in order to act upon what we learn, to implement it. So Tuhfah al-Atfaal is a poem which, as you can see on the PDF, was written by or composed by Sheikh Sulaiman al-Jamzuri. Sulaiman al-Jamzuri. And it consists of approximately 61 lines. So all these things that I mentioned now, you need to know them, yeah? They're very few. The points that I'm going to make are very few. They're not that many, but you need to remember them. And we can divide the text into 10 chapters, which is what I had previously mentioned to you. If we were just studying as a serious student, I wouldn't let you carry on until you told me those 10 chapters from the top of your head. But I'll let you off for today, unless you know them.
I know a few, yeah.
No, 10, I didn't say a few. 10 means 10, not the few. You need to all 10. How are you going to memorize the 61 lines of poetry if you can't even remember the 10 chapters? Okay, so these 10 chapters, can you read them from your list to make sure that they're the same? For the first one? Introduction, good. Chapter number 2, Ahkam of Noon, Sakin and Tanween. Yeah. Number 3, Noon and Meem with Shadda. Okay.
In chapter 4, Ahkam al-Meem Sakina.
Ahkam of Meem Sakina. طيب.
Number 5, Lam in AL, which is the noun, the definite article, and the Lam in the verbs, which is fi'l.
Lam in al and Lam in verbs. Good.
Then it was fi al-mithnayn wal-mutaqaribayn wal-mutajanisayn.
So what chapter number is that? Remember to put numbers, like, so number 6. So number 6, fi al-mithlayni wal-mutaqaribayni wal-mutajanisayn. Good.
And then number 7, aqsam al-mad.
Number 7, aqsamul mad. Good.
Number 8, ahkam al-mad.
Number 8, ahkamul mad. Good.
Number 9, aqsam al-mad al-lazim.
Al-lazim with the zaya. So aqsamul mad al-lazim.
And al-khatim.
And number 10, al-khatima, the conclusion. So these 10 chapters, or these are the 10 chapters that the author mentioned or discusses in his poem. So in the English language, we don't cover all 10 chapters. As this the first level, we would cover 6 chapters. The 4 that we will not cover are the introduction, في المثلين والمتقاربين والمتجانسين, the chapter dealing with the 2 letters which are the same or close to each other or of the same type, and the chapter of Aqsam Mad al-Lazim, the different types of Mad al-Lazim, and the conclusion. These 4 chapters we would not cover. Number 1 and number 10, the introduction and the conclusion, we don't cover because it's just Arabic. There's no actual rules that are in there. Number 2, or the other chapters that we're not going to cover, the other 2 chapters we're not going to cover, Al-Mithlaini wal-Mutaqaribaini wal-Mutajanisaini, are chapters which require previous knowledge, or for you to get the most out of them, you would need knowledge of the Makharij and the Sifat. So we don't cover that in the English language. The 3rd chapter that we don't cover is Aqsam Mad al-Lazim, which is just a theoretical approach to Mad Lazim. So Mad Lazim, there are different types, but even if you don't know what is contained in that chapter, you will read the Mad Lazim the same anyway, except for maybe one small thing. So they are not of primary concern to us. So today, inshallah, we're going to look at the first chapter out of the 10 chapters that we're going to cover, which is the chapter of Noon, Sakina and Tanween. The chapter of Noon, Sakina and Tanween. And before we start this chapter, we want to just have a look at a couple of points. There are a couple of points that we want to mention. Number 1, and these questions that I'm going to mention to you, I'm going to ask them, I may ask them next sitting. So it's important that you remember the question and you remember the answer. There are about 4 of them. Number 1, how is the noon pronounced? And the answer is on the PDF anyway. Whenever a noon is pronounced, there are 2 things which occur. The tongue touches a specific place in the mouth, i.e. behind your top teeth. And number 2, there is a nasal sound, and this is referred to in Arabic as ghunna. So whenever you pronounce a noon, an, ni, nu, na, you notice that your tongue is touching somewhere specific, and it's touching just behind your top teeth, and there is a nasal sound. There is some air that's coming out and sound that's coming out from your nose, from behind your nose. Okay. Second question is, why is Tanween discussed with the Noon Sakina? Why is the Tanween discussed with the Noon Sakina? So the Tanween, in simple terms, is that sound, or when you have 2 fathas, 2 kasras, or 2 dhammas. Tanween in simple terms, when you have 2 fathas, 2 kasras, or 2 dhammas, and it comes at the end of a word, and it is joined with the It is joined with the Noon Sakina, because every Tanween has a Noon sound. There's a Noon Sakina sound. If you pronounce 2 fathas, as you can see here, 2 fathas here, if you pronounce them on a Hamza, you say an. Can you hear Noon sound? An. Yeah. Right? Okay, what about if you say 2 kasras? In. What about if you say 2 dhammas? Un. So every Tanween has a Noon Sakina sound. That's why the author mentions them alongside each other. He says the chapter of Noon, or the rules of Noon Sakina and Tanween. Why is Tanween mentioned with the Noon Sakina? Because every Tanween has a Noon Sakina sound. So you'll hear that throughout this lesson, or this chapter, you'll hear that I'm going to refer to the Noon sound, i.e. to encompass, when I say Noon sound, it means both in Noon Sakina and in the Tanween. Yeah? So that's question number 2. What was question number 1?
Question number 1 was, how is the noon pronounced?
Good. So what 2 things occur when a noon is pronounced? Question number 2, why is Tanween mentioned alongside the Noon Sakina? Question number 3, or it's actually a point here. There are 4 main rules whenever you see a Noon Sakina or Tanween. Whenever you see a Noon Sakina or a Tanween, there are 4 main rules that can be applied. You apply one of four main rules. And this is what the author is going to speak about here. Whenever you see a nun sakina or tanween, there are four main rules. Those four main rules are: number one, izhar, which is to make it clear. Yeah? Number two, idgham, which is to mix, to put something into something else. It's to mix, but to put something within something else. The third rule is iqlab, which is to change it, to flip something, to change it. And the fourth rule is ikhfa, which is to hide. To hide.
Is this a translation of the Arabic?
What? Of the Arabic terms, you mean?
No, like you know, it says there are four main rules whenever you see them. Is this mentioned in the original code? They just translated it.
Kind of, yeah. The last point we want to mention before we start the chapter of Nun Sakin and Tanween is, how do we know which rule to apply? We said there are four main ways. When you say rules, I mean four main ways that you can read that Nun sound. How do we know which one to apply, which rule to apply? To know which rule to apply, we have to look at the letter which follows the Nun Sakina or the Tanween. So depending on which letter comes after the Nun Sakina or Tanween, the pronunciation, i.e. the Nun sound, will be pronounced differently. And that's how we know which rule to apply. Those 4 points clear to you? What was the first point?
The first point was there's two things which occur when the Nun is pronounced.
Second point?
The second point was why is the Nun Sakin mentioned with the Tanween, and did they explain why?
Good. And then the third point?
The third point was there's four different ways.
There's four main. Remember the word main.
Okay, there's four main ways.
Rules, yeah, good.
Rules while pronouncing a Tanween or a Nun Sakin.
Good.
And then the last one he mentioned, how do you know which one to apply? And that one's to look at the next letter.
Good, the letter that follows it. Excellent.